Put a slice of the cosmic web beside a slice of brain tissue, and the resemblance can be unsettling. Filaments, nodes, voids, dense hubs connected by thinner strands. In 2020, Franco, Vazza, and Alberto Feletti went further than a visual comparison. They measured statistical similarities between neural tissue and simulated cosmic structure. The resemblance is real, but that creates a much harder question. Does the same pattern mean the same cause? Because if it does, the implication seems enormous. A brain is conscious. The universe contains a network that can look brain-like. Maybe the universe is not merely shaped like a nervous system. Maybe it is one. That argument has a problem hidden in its first step. Vazza and Feletti were comparing systems separated by absurd differences in scale and built by radically different processes. The cosmic web emerges from gravitational structure formation acting on matter over billions of years. Neural tissue grows through genetics, cellular development, metabolism, plasticity, and biological constraints. And the researchers themselves made the crucial point. Similar network configurations can emerge from entirely different physical processes. Even their neural comparison had limits. It did not reconstruct true synaptic connectivity. Connections were approximated largely from spatial proximity. And the visual similarity became compelling only at selected resolutions. None of this makes the comparison worthless. It makes it interesting for the correct reason. Nature may repeatedly arrive at similar forms without repeatedly using the same mechanism. That distinction matters because the strongest version of the cosmic consciousness argument requires more than resemblance. It needs a chain, similar structure, same organizing principle, same relevant dynamics. And then, somehow, consciousness. Every link has to hold, so the real investigation is not whether fractal-like patterns exist in brains and in the cosmos. They do. The question is what those patterns can actually prove. And to answer that, we first have to separate three things that are constantly blurred together: a mathematical fractal, a natural object that scales approximately, and something that merely looks recursive. A perfect mathematical fractal is not just a complicated shape. It is an object defined by precise rules. Take the Sierpinski triangle. Start with a triangle, divide it into smaller triangles, remove the center, and repeat the operation. The pattern reproduces itself exactly as the construction continues. Mathematicians can prove properties of objects like this. Work by P.A.P. Moran in the 1940s, and later John Hutchinson, formalized results for self-similar sets. Under the right conditions, their dimension can be calculated from the scaling ratios that generate them. For the Sierpinski triangle, 3 copies appear, each scaled by 1/2. The resulting fractal dimension is about 1.585. That is a genuine mathematical result. And notice what it proves. It proves something about the geometry of an object defined by a mathematical construction. There is no hidden premise about awareness, no term for subjective experience, no variable called consciousness. The confusion begins when that rigorous mathematical word moves into nature. Real coastlines do not repeat perfectly forever. Neither do lungs, dendrites, rivers, mountains, clouds, or galaxy distributions. When Benoit Mandelbrot famously asked how long the coast of Britain is, the point was not that Britain is secretly an infinite mathematical object. The point was that measured length changes with the scale of the ruler, revealing statistical scaling behavior. That is already a different claim. And several more distinctions matter. A branching network is not automatically an exact fractal. A power law is not the same thing as a geometric fractal. A self-affine landscape can scale differently in different directions. A multifractal may require an entire spectrum of scaling exponents rather than one dimension. Then there is the weakest category of all. Something looks fractal. That can be visually suggestive. It is not a measurement. This distinction immediately breaks one popular claim: that the universe is obviously a perfect fractal because similar-looking structures appear at wildly different scales. A fern can resemble a branch. A river network can resemble blood vessels. A neuron can resemble a tree. A simulation of the cosmic web can resemble neural tissue. But resemblance does not tell us whether the scaling is exact, statistical, finite range, self-affine, multifractal, or simply visual. And even after genuine scaling has been measured, a more important question remains. Why did the pattern form? Because one of the most revealing fractals in physics does not need life, intelligence, or a mind at all. In 1981, Thomas Witten and Leonard Sander introduced a model called diffusion-limited aggregation. The ingredients are almost aggressively simple. Particles move randomly. When a moving particle reaches an existing cluster, it sticks. Repeat. What grows from this process is not a smooth ball. It becomes a delicate branching structure filled with fingers, gaps, and repeated irregularity, a fractal cluster. No nervous system is required. No planning, no awareness, no global architect telling the particles where to go. Complex form emerges from local stochastic rules. That is a serious problem for any attempt to use fractality as a consciousness detector. A useful detector has to be specific. Smoke can be evidence for fire because, under the right conditions, fire is one important cause of smoke. But if the same signal is routinely produced by dozens of unrelated mechanisms, seeing that signal tells you much less about which cause is present. Fractal-like structure has exactly this problem. Biological transport networks branch because organisms must move resources through three-dimensional bodies efficiently. River systems branch because water follows gradients, erodes terrain, merges into channels, and responds to the geometry of landscapes. Electrical discharge can branch. Crystal growth can branch. Random aggregation can branch. Dendrites can branch. The cosmic web forms filaments. The repeated geometry is interesting precisely because the causes are not identical. Sometimes similar constraints push unrelated systems towards similar solutions. Limited space matters. Transport efficiency matters. Growth from local interactions matters. Competition matters. Dimensionality matters. Optimization sometimes matters. Stochasticity sometimes matters. This is morphological convergence. Related-looking form without a requirement for related origin. Biology gives another example. Geoffrey West, James Brown, and Brian Enquist proposed an influential model in the 1990s using branching transport networks to explain patterns of biological scaling. The model helped make fractal and network ideas central to discussions of vascular systems and allometry. But even there, the existence of branching and scaling is much more secure than the claim that one unique fractal mechanism explains all biological scaling. Nature reuses useful geometries. That does not imply nature is reusing one cause. So, when a neural image and a cosmic image resemble each other, the scientific question cannot stop at, do these look statistically similar? It has to ask, what mechanism generated each one? And consciousness claims face an even stricter test, because there actually is evidence connecting fractal-like dynamics to conscious brains. That evidence deserves to be taken seriously. It just does not say what the stronger argument needs it to say. If fractality had absolutely nothing to do with consciousness research, this would be easy. But that is not the situation. In 2019, Ruiz de Miras and colleagues studied 18 healthy participants across wakefulness, non-REM sleep, and sedation using propofol or xenon. They analyzed responses using a fractal dimension-based measure of spatiotemporal complexity. The measure dropped during sleep and sedation and strongly distinguished those conditions from wakefulness within subjects. That is meaningful evidence. Particular forms of complex brain dynamics can track changes in conscious state. Then, in 2024, Charlotte Maschke, Jordan O'Byrne, Stefanie Blain-Moraes and colleagues examined critical dynamics in EEG recordings under propofol, xenon, and ketamine. Ketamine makes the comparison unusually useful. A person under ketamine can become behaviorally unresponsive while still retaining vivid internal experience. So simple responsiveness is not a perfect proxy for consciousness. The researchers found relationships between critical brain dynamics, an aesthetic state, and perturbational complexity. Their results supported the idea that operating near a critical regime may be important, perhaps even necessary, for consciousness in the human brain. That is stronger than a vague visual analogy. It is neuroscience. It involves measured brain dynamics, changing across different conscious conditions. And this is where the argument often overreaches. Suppose a property appears in a conscious brain. That does not make the property sufficient for consciousness. A running brain consumes energy. A running brain produces electrical activity. A running brain contains carbon. A running brain contains networks. None of those observations means that anything possessing the same property is conscious. The same logic applies to fractal dimension, scale-free activity, complexity, or criticality. A measurement can be useful for distinguishing states within a biological system without becoming a universal test for subjective experience. Temperature can distinguish whether water is frozen or liquid. That does not mean every object at the same temperature is water. Context matters. Mechanism matters. The relevant organization matters. The direction of the inference matters. What the neuroscience supports is something like this. Particular conscious brain states are associated with particular complex or critical dynamics. What it does not establish is the reverse claim. Any system exhibiting one of those dynamics must therefore be conscious. And there is another problem. Sometimes the signal used to infer criticality does not even prove criticality. That takes us from one uncertain bridge to two. Criticality has a specific meaning in physics. At a critical point, a system sits near a transition between regimes, and fluctuations can become correlated across many scales. That can produce striking behavior. One signature often associated with critical systems is a power law. But associated with is not the same as uniquely caused by. In 2010, Jonathan Touboul and Alain Destexhe showed that stochastic dynamics and thresholding could generate apparent power laws and patterns resembling neuronal avalanches without requiring the system to be self-organized at a critical point. Then, in 2017, they demonstrated power law statistics and universal scaling in systems away from criticality. That matters, because a seductive argument can otherwise be compressed into 3 words. Power law, therefore critical, therefore conscious. But the first therefore can fail before consciousness even enters the discussion. A power law is evidence that deserves analysis. It is not an automatic certificate of criticality, and even if independent evidence does establish critical dynamics, the second, therefore, still fails. Criticality is scientifically interesting in neuroscience because it may help brains balance stability and flexibility, integrate information across scales, and remain responsive without collapsing into either rigid order or uncontrolled activity. But critical phenomena are not exclusive to minds. So we have to distinguish a possible necessary condition from a sufficient condition. If oxygen is necessary for an ordinary wood fire, finding oxygen does not prove there is a fire. If near-critical dynamics turn out to be necessary for ordinary human consciousness, finding a near-critical system still would not prove that a system is conscious. That is an inverse inference. You observe that conscious systems often possess a feature, then infer that anything possessing the feature must be conscious. The logic does not work unless the feature is sufficiently specific. And fractal or scale-free behavior is spectacularly nonspecific. It appears in systems generated by growth, aggregation, transport, erosion, gravitational clustering, stochastic processes, and other mechanisms for which consciousness contributes nothing to the explanation. This does not make brain criticality unimportant. It means its evidential value is local before it is universal. Within brains, it may tell us something profound. Across arbitrary physical systems, it cannot simply be exported without a bridge theory explaining why the same measurable property should imply the same subjective condition. And the universe adds one more complication. Before asking whether cosmic fractality implies a cosmic mind, we should ask whether the cosmos is even fractal in the unrestricted way the claim often assumes. On smaller and intermediate astronomical scales, the universe is dramatically structured. Galaxies collect into groups and clusters. Clusters connect through filaments. Between them sit enormous voids. The result is the cosmic web. This distribution is not smooth in the everyday sense, and researchers can legitimately study scale-dependent, fractal, and multifractal properties within it. But that does not mean the universe remains one perfect fractal at every scale. In 2012, Morag Scrimger and colleagues used more than 200,000 galaxies from the Wiggles Dark Energy Survey to test how galaxy clustering behaves as the scale of measurement increases. They used counts in spheres and a statistic called the correlation dimension. For a perfectly homogeneous three-dimensional distribution, that dimension approaches 3. And at sufficiently large scales, the measured galaxy distribution moved toward that homogeneous value. The important word is statistical. The universe does not become visually featureless. Filaments and voids do not vanish. Rather, when observations are averaged over large enough volumes, large surveys support an approach toward statistical homogeneity. That makes the claim of an unrestricted, exact fractal universe much harder to sustain. There is still active research at finite scales. In 2026, Wisław Maciek and Dariusz Wojcik reported multifractal characteristics in an updated CFA galaxy catalog. That is not a contradiction. A distribution can display non-trivial multifractal clustering over one observational range while still approaching homogeneity when examined over sufficiently large scales. The scale matters, the statistic matters, the data set matters, and none of these measurements contains a consciousness variable. This is worth emphasizing because cosmic fractality sometimes functions rhetorically, as though it were already a settled metaphysical result. It is not. Cosmology is asking questions about matter distribution, clustering, scaling, and homogeneity. Even a perfect demonstration of finite-range multifractality would remain a structural result. To turn that result into evidence of a cosmic subject, one still needs the missing bridge. So if the scientific argument is incomplete, where does the idea of a conscious cosmos actually belong? Not outside serious thought, inside philosophy. And treating that distinction fairly makes the evidence clearer, not weaker. Cosmopsychism is not merely the claim that galaxies look like neurons. It is a philosophical position about the place of consciousness in reality. Different versions vary, but the central idea is that the cosmos as a whole may possess fundamental phenomenal properties, with individual minds somehow related to that more basic conscious reality. That position sits inside a serious debate about the mind-matter problem. How can subjective experience arise from physical processes? Is consciousness wholly emergent? Is it fundamental? Can small conscious subjects combine into larger ones? Or could individual subjects derive from a more fundamental conscious whole? Philosophers such as Stefanie have developed cosmopsychist arguments around issues like coherence, monism, constitution, and the relation between individual consciousness and the cosmos. Those arguments do not require a theorem that says fractals produce awareness. Gregory Matloff has made a more observationally oriented case, arguing that pervasive self-organization in nature may be compatible with panpsychist ideas. That is a legitimate philosophical interpretation, but compatible is doing important work. A pattern can be compatible with many explanations. Self-organization is compatible with a conscious universe metaphysics. It is also predicted by non-conscious models involving gravity, stochastic aggregation, chemical dynamics, biological evolution, network optimization, and local interaction. When competing explanations predict the same observation, the observation does not strongly discriminate between them. That is underdetermination. And this is the point where criticism can become unfair if it goes too far. Showing that fractality does not prove cosmopsychism does not prove cosmopsychism false. Those are different claims. The metaphysical possibility remains open. A future theory of consciousness might transform the debate. New empirical criteria might emerge. A genuine bridge principle might someday connect a precisely defined physical organization to phenomenal experience, but that bridge would need independent support. It cannot be smuggled in through visual resemblance. It cannot be assumed because similar mathematics appears in two systems. And it cannot be manufactured by reversing a correlation found inside brains. That leaves us with the central question. What exactly would have to be true before a fractal pattern could count as evidence for consciousness, rather than merely as an interesting pattern? Imagine we define one property. Call it F. F means a system exhibits some precisely measured fractal, scale-free, or critical organization. Now define CC means the system is conscious. Neuroscience might eventually show that in human brains, when C changes, a particular version of F tends to change with it. That would be valuable, but it would not establish that every system with F also has C. To make that jump, we would need a bridge principle. Something like this: a physical system possessing fractal property X under conditions Y reliably possesses phenomenal consciousness. Then that principle would have to survive attempts to break it. Diffusion-limited aggregation would become relevant. Non-neural critical systems would become relevant. Power laws generated away from criticality would become relevant. Biological branching systems would become relevant. Astronomical structure would become relevant. Each non-conscious counterexample would test whether the supposed signature was actually specific to consciousness. Right now, no established theorem or validated empirical law gives us that bridge. And without it, the cosmic consciousness inference encounters three separate obstacles. First is the inverse inference. A conscious brain can exhibit a property without that property implying consciousness everywhere it appears. Second is causal underdetermination. Similar structures can be produced by different mechanisms. Gravity and neurobiology do not become the same process because their networks share statistics. Third is a composition problem. Even if conscious beings exist inside the universe, and even if consciousness-associated dynamics occur in parts of it, that does not establish that the universe as a single whole forms one unified conscious subject. That conclusion requires additional theory. This is where the evidence actually ends. Not at the claim that consciousness is impossible on a cosmic scale, not at the claim that cosmopsychism is meaningless. At a narrower and much cleaner boundary, fractal patterns show that nature can generate striking forms repeatedly across very different systems. Brain research shows that some scale-dependent and critical dynamics can correlate with conscious state. Cosmology shows that matter can form rich clustered networks, sometimes with fractal or multifractal characteristics over finite ranges. All of those statements can be true simultaneously, and the universe can still remain either conscious or non-conscious, because none of them tells us which. There is a simple way to test the next extraordinary pattern claim you encounter. Ask what has actually been measured. Then ask whether that measurement is specific to consciousness or appears in clearly non-conscious systems too. Finally, ask for the bridge. What independent evidence turns this structural property into a reliable indicator of subjective experience? If the bridge is missing, the pattern may still be beautiful. It may still be scientifically important. It may even inspire a serious philosophy. But resemblance is not identity. Correlation is not sufficiency. And a recurring shape is not a proof of a mind.